Okay, I think let's start. Maybe it's also very nice to see some familiar faces from other excellence events and other places. So welcome again. This is the Excellence Institute's second Café Croissant. We are a pop-up institute right now being incubated at the Berkman Klein Center for Internet and Society at Harvard University. And today we are joined by Elizabeth Adams and Bruce Schneier to discuss how surveillance is eroding the social fabric of our cities. I'm going to pass the virtual baton to our executive chairman, Yves Dacord, who will moderate the conversation and introduce our speakers. Yves, over to you.
Thank you very much, Beatrice, and very pleased to see you and to see our community again. That's great. We will be together for a bit less than an hour. And we have the chance to really explore an issue that is really at the core of the ambitions, I would say, of the Excellence Institute, which is really to look at digital surveillance and how much digital surveillance is changing, in a way, the social fabric of our city. So we made the choice to really look at the questions of digital surveillance, and we will explore what does that mean, what are we talking about. We also made the choice to look at the impact it has on the people and the social fabric in our collective, and of course our terrain, our favorite terrain, which are the cities and the, let's say, the urban environment. And we're very grateful because and very lucky because we have two remarkable people. They're not only remarkable because they come from Minneapolis. I understood this is normal, so let's relax about it. But both of them bring with them a lot of expertise and, I would say, practice and reflections, and they're coming from different point of view, which is quite remarkable. So first, Elizabeth, very happy to see you again. You were with us at the soft launch of the Excellence Institute last month. Elizabeth, you are a founding member of POSTME, which is a public oversight of surveillance technology in Minneapolis. You are also a fellow at Civil Society Lab at Stanford. You are an expert on AI, and I think one of the interesting things, you are the chief AI ethics advisor at Paravision, which is a computer vision company that specializes in facial recognition, so super interesting. And last but not least, you've spent quite some years also in the defense industry and intelligence industry. So I think a very interesting background and interesting experience and practice. And I would like to give you the floor to start with you, and then I will introduce Bruce. So 10 minutes, you are somewhat, give us a little bit of your take about the issues. I will then ask Bruce to do the same, and then we will start to have a conversation. Maybe just a last word to everybody here. The conversation will be first between Bruce and Elizabeth, but then I would be very happy to introduce you also. So don't hesitate to ask any questions around the chat. Beatrice will moderate that. And then we will also open the floor to have a conversation among all of us. So Elizabeth, we start with you.
All right, thank you so much. As mentioned, I am Elizabeth M. Adams, and I bring you greetings from Minneapolis, Minnesota. I'm thrilled to be here today to share a little bit of my work, my research as a race and tech practitioner fellow at Stanford. But I must thank the Excellence Institute for the invitation to explore what a more fair and equitable city could look like as we continue to address this question. So digital surveillance, digital privacy are creating challenges in cities across the globe, challenges such that policymakers are now faced with how to address data privacy, digital justice, digital inclusion, and of course, digital surveillance. They're beginning to ask questions like, who is driving the technology that governments are procuring? How can we, as governments who adopt surveillance use, be sure that the technology is trustworthy? How are societies impacted? So there's so many questions, but not enough answers. But I'm happy that I've been working in the space in civil society to help address some of these questions. So the civic tech initiative that you heard that I've worked on the past year is called POSTME, Public Oversight of Surveillance Technology and Military Equipment. I'm a founding member, and we formed this coalition early last year to work on advocating for transparency, oversight, accountability, and equity in the use of technology by the city of Minneapolis. And following the murder of George Floyd here in Minneapolis, our work became particularly motivated by the urging for accountability and how law enforcement was using surveillance technologies that they had at their disposal. But POSTME doesn't come from a place of technophobia. Rather, our coalition is about embracing technology proactively so that when these tools are thought of, when they're procured or even implemented, communities have shared decision-making in the use of these tools, that they're used responsibly and not used to target certain populations. So as I mentioned earlier, how can governments know if technologies that they've procured are used, they're using, is trustworthy and unbiased? And this brings us back to our original question: how is digital surveillance changing the social fabric in our cities? And from my perspective as a technologist, and where my research starts is in the design and concept sessions throughout the product and technology lifecycle. This is where oversight, ethics, and social impacts are often not prioritized or valued. Because in order for technology to make its way into the marketplace, there are a series of approvals that happen throughout the organization. But what happens when our technology worlds and our social worlds collide? We get the results of the headlines on the right. And the biggest impact from our POSTME work happened on February 12th of this year, with the Minneapolis City Council banning facial recognition technology. This was an enormous community lift. And there are many stories behind the headlines. You see, before you can even get to a city council passing your proposed legislation, there's a different kind of development. There's advocacy development. There's processes happening which include coalition building, educating the community and policymakers, and really understanding the legislative process. This is just one way that digital surveillance is changing the social fabric, because it's becoming an us against them. Communities and governments against tech companies, or communities against governments and tech companies. You get what I'm saying. And surveillance is causing us to lose trust in our ability to roam through life safely. So taking this one step further, in order for this advocacy work to happen, communities are taking away time from their lives to pursue these initiatives. Now they're faced with trade-offs. Do I enjoy life experiences with friends and family? Or do I advocate for protections that should be a basic human right? And this is what I call an additional tax, a trauma tax. Now there's just one more thing for communities to have to fight for, one additional thing that is levied against them. I'll quickly highlight that these are the types of surveillance technologies we included in our original draft ordinances for the Minneapolis City Council. Computer vision, location tracking, biometric surveillance, and then there were some additional considerations such as energy consumption and smart grid surveillance. And all of these tools, or many of these tools, are available to law enforcement who are using them to augment their work. I'd like to share a bit more about why communities are having to stand up for themselves instead of enjoying time with their families at the lake and museums and libraries. There's a new normal that is perpetuating existing trauma in our cities onto those who are used to law enforcement overreaching in their communities. And now these authorities are using a host of surveillance technologies. So we looked into various computer vision models to see if some of our concerns were valid. In this computer vision example, we used AI. So in both pictures, a temperature is being taken with an infrared thermometer. And with the image on the left of the lighter skinned hand and the lighter skinned person, the algorithm predicts one set of labels, 68% probability that the image includes technology. But with the image on the right of the darker skinned hand and the darker skinned person, the algorithm predicts different labeling, 80% probability that the image includes a gun. Well, let's take this a step further. And in this example, one of our coalition members lightened the image to see if the prediction would change. And as you can see, it does. Once the image was lightened, the gun was not predicted, but what was predicted instead was a hand. Talking about social fabric and changing the social fabric, everyday citizens are doing the work of calling these things out, and the impacts to communities of color and vulnerable populations are great, and they have the potential to do irreversible harm. So what can we do? Partnerships. We need solutions that support businesses, governments, academia, and society interacting together in ways which allow us to advance and thrive. The space for what's wrong is very, very crowded. And we need community involvement in our fusion centers and our command centers. And we need to start asking how we can use technology to bring us together. How can we get to thriving? Advocating for equity. And in seeing more and more interest in these partnerships, we need to also consider that equity is not just a seat at the table to discuss challenges, which is great, but we need to pay community members for their time for helping to contribute to a more fair and trustworthy society. This is how you help close the wealth gap and give communities a fighting chance. We need to treat expertise in society as just as important and valuable as a data scientist. And listen and act. Communities will tell you exactly what they want and exactly what they need. And as a technologist, my mind goes directly to the how, but we need to listen and then we need to act. And as a technologist, the goal in agile development is to work in sprints by delivering an MVP, a minimal viable product. You want a car? Deliver a skateboard, then a motorcycle, then a car. And I forgot the bike, a bike, then a motorcycle. But this is why technology is outpacing community and governments. It's because of the mindset that we have when we start our development life cycle. We need to share our technology methodologies with the community. So again, I'm hoping that by seeing some of the creative ways to build partnerships between businesses, governments, academia, and society, we can adopt co-creation, shared leadership, shared decision-making in our own cities to deliver solutions which make our communities and our planets stronger. And with that, I'd like to turn it back over.
Amazing, Elizabeth. Before turning to Bruce, can I just ask you a question?
Yeah.
I was really interested about what you said in terms of the equity questions. Could you just tell us a bit more, just to make sure that we grasp it? And what are we talking about, right? Because we use equity a lot, but
yes,
I found that super interesting and super challenging.
So there's been lots of questions about diversity, equity, and inclusion. And what happens in a lot of corporate spaces is you bring in diversity people or you bring in people to talk about certain topics, but they're not paid as much as some other folks in the organization. And so I liken that experience of 20 years of dealing with that, the same with society. So now we run into this, what people are considering a pipeline issue with AI ethics. And so people are looking to the community to bring in experts to help them understand AI ethics, how to unpack the technology lifecycle, how do they build their proper marketing materials and support customer service, finance, training, and all of that. And my recommendation is that we pay people like you would pay a data scientist, because they too are helping you advance your innovation, help you protect your intellectual property, and continue with these strategies that companies want to adopt.
Very interesting, and we'll come back to that. Thank you very much, Elizabeth. That was a great start. Let me now introduce you, Bruce Schneier. I think the community here at Edgerton Institute and people around knows you very well, Bruce, and we are very happy to see you. You're not coming only from Minneapolis also, but you are, as The Economist said one day, a guru when it comes to security. I don't know if it's good, by the way, to be called a guru when it comes to security, but it's so interesting. You've explored a lot of things. You've wrote a lot of books. I think your last one was a book around We Have Roots. You've wrote a lot of academic papers. You are part of, let's say, the eco system of Harvard at the Berkman Klein Centers, but also at the Harvard Kennedy Schools and the Harvard Law School. And what is interesting is you've really thought a lot about some of these questions. So Bruce, please give us your take. You have max 10 minutes, and then we'll be able to start the conversation. And can I ask also everybody, because I saw new people are coming to join us, to put your mic on mute. You will have the chance to talk afterwards. Bruce, floor is yours.
All right, so first, I actually don't know if it's good to be called a guru. I'm kind of mixed on it, but it's sort of neat. And second, that computer vision example with the hand and the temperature meter is horrific. Wow, I thought we were beyond that in 2021, and it's horrible we're not. So I tend to be a generalist. I write a lot about data and privacy. I have a book on data and privacy called Data and Goliath. I want to talk about surveillance and how it affects people and communities in general. And specifically, I'm thinking about ubiquitous surveillance. And ubiquitous surveillance is not what you think of when you see on television, follow that car. Ubiquitous surveillance is follow every car. And that is a new type of surveillance that is made possible by computer systems. I mean, this phone allows you to follow every car, the phone system. because we all have one. It's all in our pockets. They all have GPS. We're all using nav systems or other apps. And when you can follow every car, there are things you can do that are different, right? You can surveil people backwards in time. You just keep the data. So I can follow you last week, last month. I can follow you based on type. I can follow everybody with this name, everybody with this gender, everybody of this ethnicity. So I can do lots of things. I can search databases for things you're talking about. So you think of a normal surveillance, I might put a bug in on your phone in your home and listen to you. With ubiquitous surveillance, I can monitor everybody's SMSs, email, looking for different topics for keywords. It's a very different type of surveillance that basically is community-wide by its nature. It's not targeted on an individual. It's casting a wide net, possibly looking for people individually, or possibly, like it might happen in China, looking for topics of conversation. And this type of surveillance has a lot of effects. I really liked Elizabeth's comment, taking away the ability to roam through life safely. I think that's an important thing to think about, because we know from lots of surveys that people under the threat of ubiquitous surveillance self-censor themselves. Right? There are things you didn't search for on Google in the months after a terrorist attack or a particular political movement, depending on what country you're in. And when people self-censor, people in communities that feel they're being surveilled, self-censor. Right? And that affects their ability just to be in the world. Right? You know, and I mean, some of it's kind of obvious. I mean, if you search pressure cooker bomb, right, in the weeks after the Boston Marathon bombing, you might think twice before you do that. I mean, it's my career. Of course, I search it. Lots of people don't. The really good documentary in 2006 from the Islamic community in the Michigan suburbs, how they were affected by ubiquitous surveillance post September 11th. And it very much affects the fabric of society. And it's important to think of this broadly. I mean, I'm super thrilled with the win in Minneapolis about facial recognition. But if you saw Elizabeth's slide, it was not about facial recognition. It is about just the character of surveillance. When you think of surveillance, it's three steps. Identification, it's some technology that identifies you. It might be your face, it might be your gait, it might be a retinal scan at a distance, it might be the MAC ID on your phone, something that identifies who you are. And then that is aggregated with other data about you. And that is used to make some discriminatory decision. Right? It is somehow putting you in a category and making a decision based on that. And it's real important that we don't focus on facial recognition at the expense of everything else. The last thing I want to talk about is surveillance as an inhibitor to social change. So if you think about any social progress, tends to go from something being disapproved to approved to legal. I mean, we're going to take gay marriage, right? Gay marriage went from, the beginning of this century, something that was illegal and abhorred, to illegal, and then more and more people are public about it and goes forward, and eventually becomes moral, and then sort of by magic, it becomes legal. Now, for that process to happen, it is vital that people have privacy to do things in secret. Right? In order for gay marriage to get from illegal to legal, right, someone has to try gay sex once and say, that was kind of fun. That wasn't that bad. And eventually there's an underground movement, and eventually it becomes a little public, and eventually becomes more public. If society through surveillance has the ability to nip someone who is doing that thing way back in the beginning, society never grows. And this is, you can say this same story about marijuana legalization, which is going along the same trajectory, but a few years behind. And sort of any other changes in our morality. If no one can smoke pot in private, pot never becomes legal, because there's never an underground movement that gets bigger and gets more common and more accepted. So ubiquitous surveillance actually has the ability to stop societal progress in its tracks. And that is incredibly dangerous and incredibly damaging. It actually is important that people have private spaces where they can break the law, where they can try different things that society disapproves of. And with that, I'll stop. And I'm looking forward to this conversation.
Bruce, thank you very much. I think I really see the excitement around us, because I think the issues are quite remarkable. Before opening up and also bringing you, Elizabeth, just one question for you at the beginning when you said something important, Bruce. You were talking about I. You said, I can do a lot with my phone. I can do. What is this I? I is me as an individual, me as a government, me as a corporate?
So, you know, everybody spies on you. I mean, modern ubiquitous surveillance is ubiquitous. I mean, they know, so it's apps on your phone, it's governments. So it is both corporate and government surveillance. And there is this public-private surveillance partnership. There's a lot of surveillance data the government can't collect legally that it buys from corporations. There's a lot of data that corporations have trouble collecting that they buy from governments. And that's in the US. You move to a country like China, there's a much tighter public-private surveillance partnership, but both really go hand in hand. So you think of it as power surveilling. And this is why I think it's really hard to get good legislation at a national level, because the government likes surveillance just as much as the corporates do. You go down to the cities, like Minneapolis, Somerville in Massachusetts, Oakland in California. You know, we have seen legislation banning certain types of surveillance, but those are exceptions. And it's been really hard to move that outside of traditional liberal enclaves. And that's because the government likes it just as much as the corporates do.
Okay, I think it's a critical issue. Elizabeth, when we talk about the government likes it, right? Or feel that useful, what are we talking about? What is your experience, right? Over the last, let's say, 15 years, or maybe we can say even 20 years. I don't know if 9/11 is maybe the moment of total change, right? I'm interested to know, how do you see, if we start with government being interested and being willing to play with it? And then are we talking about national government, cities? Elizabeth.
Yeah, I think there's a lot to unpack. So when I ran a systems integration lab for the Department of Defense, we had 200 technologists, and it was that we deliver technology products for the military operation. And one thing I want to say is that's why I said POSTME is not technophobia, because I've worked in this space where we here, at least in the US, get to enjoy certain things like going to get coffee and watching, soccer games, because there are these things, surveillance tools that are being used to keep us safe. And so there is an interest in that, right? Governments do need to have some sort of technology to govern, to make sure that our cities are safe, that people are not, harming water sanitation places and so forth. All of these things, and that traffic can move. And in case there is some sort of incident, that they're able to find abusers, so to speak. But the challenge for me, and this is where I differ just a little bit with what Bruce said, in that I think we can think about facial recognition and the surveillance pieces that I mentioned, in addition to other types of surveillance, which is what is happening with our phones. I think we have to, at least from my perspective and from my lived experience and vantage point, we have to think about all of it, because I don't get the luxury as a Black woman to not because I can go somewhere and be in someone's database, or someone thinks that it's me, and there can cause harm to my life. And so I understand why governments need it. I've worked in this space. It is important, but we need to have, if it's going to be used in communities, specifically in those communities that have a history of over-policing and overreaching, then we need to have a different conversation. So I hope that answers the question.
And just on that one, Elizabeth, and then I'll come back to you, Bruce. To have a conversation, you need to have people being willing to have a conversation, right, on both sides. Or that's one element. Of course, governments, most of the time, are not really willing to do that. But you mentioned several times also the questions of, I don't know if it's awareness, education, and I'm wondering if it's not an excuse somewhat to not allow the conversation to happen, because as you mentioned, it is about the people, it's about their experience. So how do you see that happening?
What happened here in Minneapolis, I found that our city council, elected officials, city attorney, whomever, were very willing to learn and understand. A lot of people want to learn. We just haven't gotten to the how. Like, what are some of the ways that they can quickly ingest all of this information that is being flooded in the internet streets, right, about AI ethics and what it means? How can we help them synthesize the information? Because I talk to my council member all the time. She's focused on a lot of things, not just policing, street closures and what's happening in schools and all in COVID, tracing, tracking, and vaccination. So she has a lot of things as an elected official that she has to think about. And so that's why I said we've got to figure out a way to pay community, because I'm helping, but I'm not getting paid for it, to help advance fair and equitable societies here in Minneapolis. So I haven't found, fortunately, any policymaker or an executive of tech companies who weren't willing to learn. They're just looking for the how. What are some toolkits? What are some things that we can give them so that they can be comfortable and prepared as they learn how to address AI ethics in their own organizations or government seats?
Bruce, back to...
I'm curious, before I ask, who's your council person?
Lisa Goodman.
Okay, yeah, she's good. She's good.
That's good to know. Bruce, what do you make?
Local for us.
No, yes. No. I want to go back to the first question that Elizabeth somewhat explored, and together with you, Bruce, is what are we talking about when we talk about we should have a conversation? You also speak a lot, and I'm still struggling about what does that mean for government? Who needs to have this conversation?
I mean, so right now, the level of surveillance in our society is primarily to benefit a handful of tech billionaires. And that is, there's no conversation about how we as society should be. We're not having these conversations, mostly because government abdicates in the United States. And it's very laissez-faire, very libertarian. And we're just not having these sort of high-level conversations about what surveillance does to society. What is the optimal level? I mean, we understand, and no one who is on the side of privacy says that the police should not have the ability to investigate crimes. I mean, we already give the police an enormous amount of power to pry into our personal lives. We do that willingly because that's how they solve crimes. But we have this process that in theory is supposed to be a check on them. It's the warrant process. They have to go in front of a judge and present evidence of why they should surveil somebody. Now, there are lots of ways this fails in practice, right? But in theory, that is a security check. And that was a result of a conversation that happened hundreds of years ago about police abuses. And the conversations about algorithmic discrimination, the conversations about ubiquitous surveillance and databases of behavioral information about us aren't happening. They're not really happening at any level. Local level is where we can point things, it seems. There's less lobbying. I think there's legislators who are more concerned about what their constituents want and believe. Our US Congress isn't in the same way. It's more party focused. It's more our team, you're their team. And it is sort of interesting that we can do stuff at the local level. But I think these really have to be conversations of what sort of society we want to live in.
And
how
would
does
you
it
say,
look?
both of you, that this conversation can happen? Because if we start with the angle of society or societal issues, we can see immediately why it's important to bring everybody on board, right? And we need to start from the practice, from the lived experience of the people. At the same time, sometimes when we talk about surveillance, people feel this is a national issue, very complex. It's difficult to bring the people on board. I'm still reflecting, Bruce, you just said in your last blog that in Australia, I think, they were talking about having cybersecurity be taught to the kids at 5 years old. Is that correct?
It's an odd little story. I mean, there's definitely a generational gap here. I mean, there's a lot that sort of the typical Silicon Valley engineer doesn't get about how society works. Elizabeth is speaking about this, pretty precisely, and it's important. So I'm less enthusiastic about teaching 5-year-olds security and more enthusiastic about listening to them about how they view the world, which is different than
Well, let's
how
go back
we
to you, Elizabeth, because you were very, in your reflection, you put very high the question of listening, right? You said really this is completely.
Yes.
Yeah, I honestly think there's this term that I read about, I think it's a few years old, but it's like global actualization or community actualization. So it's taking self-actualization to the next level. And that to me is a very poignant question. How do we all get to thriving? How do we all get to a place where we are living out our highest potentials? Because then we can think about what kinds of ways to insert technology into that process so that we can do that, versus technology that is just being developed, rushed into the marketplace, and it's causing harm. And now we have this vicious cycle of starting all over again and having these conversations, and or people advocating to get the governments involved. And I developed this model through my fellowship, but it was really about tech insertion for eradicating or eliminating racism. But I think it can still be used for that, because at the top of this kind of model, it's communities that are thriving, and at the bottom, it's institutional, generational, and systemic racism. But in my time of the Department of Defense, I led a team that was responsible for technology insertion, and every month we brought in new technologies, and if they could not fit into our environment, and if those technologies could not keep warfighters safe, that we let them go. And so these are the kinds of examples of how do we get to actualization? What does that look like? Because again, we can kind of keep carving down these roads and these lanes, but is it really getting us to all humans living out their greatest potential?
So that's what's important, right? It's that we, who is included in we, and in the current surveillance capitalism system we have, the we is the profits of the tech companies, and that's a very different sort of we. I mean, it's kind of a dumb way to build society based on the profits of tech companies, and so a broader we, right? We acting collectively as citizens versus individually as consumers is going to be the way to move forward on this. It is super hard. Right? In the US, nobody wants to hear that. Nobody wants to regulate tech. And any win we have is like, I think, an amazing exception. But it is going to be the way we have to move forward.
And I'll just,
Elizabeth,
sorry, I'll just add real quick, and to Bruce's point, after 4 years of working in the AI ethics space, my focus is now on executives, because I've spent a lot of times with executives talking with them about things, and many of them are very far removed from the actual work that happens at the data science level. They're signing off on things and they don't know, and then they're finding out that the FTC or NIST has frameworks, or whoever, the EU has guidelines, and they don't know what to do. And so I have found actually that to be a bit more, there's more progress in that space, because I was at the other end, right? The community end. And that is traumatic. I'm working all day, and then now I'm sitting with policymakers, educating them about what's going on, where at the very beginning of the process, if I can help and do my part, helping educate executives, people who can direct it, and not just technical executives, but non-technical executives too, marketing, customer care, training, so forth. Finding that I'm finding more joy in this space, because again, the impacts, the second and third order consequences are starting for me at that space.
So are you both saying, and in the chat also a lot of people are talking about digital literacy. So are you saying, yes, there is an issue about digital literacy? And I think, Elizabeth, you're talking about leaders. So it means our politicians, our leaders, they find it difficult to understand the impact on the society. Do you agree with that?
I guess
yeah. Okay, Bruce.
It's been yes, but it's more complicated than that. I mean, I think people tend to be really intuitive about their own space, and the notion that young people don't care about privacy is complete and utter bullshit. I mean, it is. People really do understand privacy. They have their own threat model, and you have to understand their threat model. As you move up, I think you get the older people.
Up what? Up in the age or in hierarchy?
Maybe CEOs, legislators. Okay. They, I think, don't understand a lot of technology. Don't understand what's happening. They're being fed things by lobbyists. So digital literacy at the level of our leaders, I think, is important. But if you think about any one of our legislators, they don't understand anything they're legislating, whether it's, you know, national security or agriculture policy. They have experts on their staffs. And what we're missing are technologists on legislative staffs. Then I'm thinking of the national, congressional, and Senate level. There just aren't enough of them. And we need a lot more of them because they are making decisions without the relevant expertise. And they're being plied by lobbyists. Yeah.
Elizabeth, what is your take?
Well, I like Chris's comment, which is that they don't think that digital literacy is a real issue so much as it's that people are not willing to explain it to lawmakers in a way that they can explain it at their level. And that is basically what I experienced. And so there are a couple of fellows in my cohort, and one is Hong Kuo. He has done AI blind spots out of Harvard. He's actually worked on that. It's a set of cards that you take through the process of technology development to figure out if you have blind spots. And then there's another one that has toolkits, but it was for a different process. And so I think we have to simplify some of these things that we are offering. I'm a technologist. Going in and talking about algorithmic bias and modeling and data association and data aggregation is not going to work for a policymaker, because in the back of their mind, they're thinking about, you know, how am I going to make sure that my city is safe? How am I going to make sure that kids can go back to school safely? And so you do have to kind of break things down. And for me, that was a lot of work, right? And so now we have the opposite end of this life cycle or this process where governments and communities are doing all the work, when a lot of it, in my opinion, as a technologist, being in the technology space for over 20 years, really starts at that design concept session and cycle with those who are approving the budgets, those who are signing off on the technology, the legal teams, the general counsel. All of those folks are saying, yes, this is ready for the market. And helping them understand, no, it's not really ready for the market. But you know, it's not going to happen overnight. Storytelling has been a very good way for me to, you know, speak with people in all different facets, all around the world, from governments, executives, and all of that. Really bringing in these stories that we've talked about today, the impacts to society and community.
And it's really hard to
have a time where accountability will be bigger and oversight when it comes to this kind of issue.
What was the first part? I'm sorry.
Accountability, because you use the two notions, right? And much more accountable and kind of the ability to have oversight about on issues related to surveillance.
Well, if you saw the FTC's latest guidance, that to me was the most sting I've seen out of something. And it says, if you don't handle your algorithmic bias or make sure that there isn't bias in your algorithms, we will do it for you. And that's what they said. That's exactly the words that they used. And so that is kind of scaring some people. And they have examples of exactly who it was that they've worked with on that.
Great. Bruce, you take on that one. And then I would like to bring in our colleagues who seems to be very active on the chat. Bruce.
The only point I want to make is that it's actually really hard for a legislator to have a position that goes against the police. If the police want something, at a national level, if the military wants something, it is really hard to say no. It just looks bad to your constituents. So giving people language, we're fighting this in many fronts. Now, how do you say that, yes, the police want this, but they shouldn't have it? It is not good for society to give the police this power, this capability. And this is much broader than surveillance. We need to have those conversations on how to limit authority and not maximize it. It's hard in this, we're afraid of the terrorists, we're afraid of the diseases, but we really need to do it.
I just would like to bring some of you and maybe start with Rachel. I saw, Rachel, you had several questions, but maybe what I found interesting reading and listening to you, Rachel, was really somewhat you have some doubt about regulation, right? That you feel that regulation, I don't know where you situate, but you said even, in the 19th century, there was already surveillance and somewhat there. Tell us a bit more, what is your reflections?
Yeah, thank you. My field of research is actually legal digital literacy. So actually trying to understand how people approach legal systems, such as especially on the civil side of law. In terms of historic trend, it's very interesting. I'm British, but I've done a lot of reading around the American surveillance systems, and American capitalism has had hard baked into it surveillance ever since the founding of the Republic. Like, you go all the way back to the 1780s and 90s, and you have this surveillance culture baked into both the federal government and the state governments. So when we're talking about surveillance now, it's like you can draw on the 1960s and 70s when the FBI were spying on communities of color and also the workers' rights back in the 1920s. Like you had this whole history of the Pinkertons, for instance, tamping down on workers' rights. And so when we're talking about surveillance today, lawmakers don't necessarily want to control it or regulate it in the way that we assume they do, because it actually serves the state's benefit to ensure that especially in the states where the structures are very much tilted towards corporations, are tilted towards extractive capitalist processes, that you can remove as much surveillance as you want, but on an intrinsic level, there's always going to be the state is going to intrude into those processes. So to fight back against that, you're fighting back an uphill battle both against corporate interests and the interests of the state. So like, it was interesting with Black Lives Matter. There was an article in The Guardian this morning about how there's a huge backlash against Black Lives Matter in the UK, and that the UK government is pushing back against those people who were protesting through both state surveillance and also through social media. And so there's this big co-option of state need and state want versus what actually citizens need. And when I was referring to digital literacy, I'm not just talking about how people understand how technology work, but how they use it in their day-to-day lives, how they can opt out of it if they don't want to be part of it. And I noticed someone here was talking about ad blockers and cookie blockers. That's part of it, but also not wanting to be part of the extractive processes that we bring into it. Yeah, you're talking about the military industrial complex, including the police. That's one part of it. But the argument also comes in who benefits from this, who is benefiting from these surveillance processes. And if the answer is not the communities that the politicians serve, then that surely should be the starting point. It should be where the activism and the grassroots movements come in. It's interesting, Elizabeth was talking about Minneapolis. It's like here in the UK, the Metropolitan Police in London have been using surveillance technology on the streets, and there's a big uproar about it because it's being viewed as really intrusive, and it's targeting ethnic minorities in particular because they're the ones who, based on past record, the police have been using in the past. And the term the new Jim Crow is becoming even more prevalent because it's baking in old assumptions. And as much as you want to get rid of biases, all of the systems that are being built at the moment are usually by middle-class white men. And all of the systems, especially in the US, and that then being exported in places like the UK, having their hard-coded biases being put right in at the very beginning. And even if you were to diversify the basic programming, you've still got 30, 40, 50 years of computer science history behind you to overcome before you get to the point where you want to move in the future.
Rachel, let me just thank you for that, and let me just go back to the panel, because I think it's a rather how can I formulate it's a rather grim picture where what you picture is really a system which is deeply influenced. And I think trying to see, I'm interested to hear you, Elizabeth, in your own experience. You know the systems, right? Now you're working with community, but also leaders. Okay, how does that connect?
I first off, that was amazing, and Thank you for that. That has been my experience my whole entire life, being someone's either their ROI because they want to have diversity. So I've been a part of someone's data base, aggregated to determine what my value is to their organization or to society. Am I a threat? Am I a menace? Whatever it is. That is why, for me, honestly, and I know this is probably going to take the conversation somewhere different, I have to approach this as a human, because I have spent most of my life, I don't want to call it fighting, but challenging these systems. I wake up every day challenging a system that doesn't want me there because of my gender or the color of my skin. And so what works for me is to start turning the conversation towards more purposeful AI, more AI enabled, a life where we can all thrive. That's what I talked about: global actualization and social actualization and community actualization, because it will never end. And that is the other reason why I said the space of what's wrong is crowded. It's centuries wrong. It's not just 4 years wrong, it's centuries wrong. And here in Minneapolis, I might have mentioned this before in the first one, my great-great-grandfather was the first Black fire chief in the city of St. Paul. So we've been talking, and this was well before, it was like the site, part of segregation, right? And so we've been dealing with this, communities have been dealing with these types of things for years. And he had to use a separate firehouse for the Black firefighters. But my point is really, that's why I'm moving towards something different. I don't want to keep waking up and fighting these systems because someone says, because of the color of my skin, I should be over-policed, or I'm a threat, or because of my gender, I shouldn't get the same pay, right? And there's data that is being aggregated and is being pushed out, whether it is a resume sifting, algorithm or something else that says that I don't belong in these spaces. So that's why for me, I'm moving more towards how can we use technology to help us all reach our most highest potential? Because and I'll say this before I end, as a Black woman, having to relive these conversations is very different than someone who might study it or have the conversation about it. Having the lived experience is very, very different, and it can take a toll on you.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you very much. Bruce?
I'm not even sure what to add to that. I mean, it's vitally important and something we don't do. And looking at society as a whole and everybody is the only way to solve any of this. I really think that Rachel, I don't know if I'm pronouncing that right, that Rachel's comments, I think are really accurate. Surveillance is a part of capitalism. The difference that I wanted to highlight is that now technology involves ubiquitous surveillance. And that is a different sort of animal. And it allows for different things. And this is what Shoshana Zuboff talks about when she talks about surveillance capitalism. She's talking about ubiquitous surveillance and how that changes everything. And it's changing it in a way that we are not being deliberate about, that we're not being deliberative about, that we're allowing to happen because the tech billionaires want it. And that's going to be really bad for society. And we're already seeing it. And it's going to get worse as computers become more autonomous, have more automation, and get physical agency. And that's the Internet of Things, that's AI, that's robotics. The next generation is going to make this much worse.
Let me bring in, thank you, Bruce. Let me bring in Chris. Chris, you have a question? Chris, where are you? Yes.
Chris is just a name on the screen and not
No, but he was very active. Chris, video, that would be great. Okay, I don't see Chris.
Well, Chris is off mute, so with his progress.
Yeah, exactly, but maybe it doesn't work. Okay, let me just then I would like to go back to you, Elizabeth, and maybe just
that bugger.
Chris is there?
Yes, sorry. Can folks hear me?
Yeah,
yes.
We can hear you. Go on.
Sorry. Yeah, hey Elizabeth. It was cool to see this pop up on my feed. I'm also part of the Minneapolis coalition, so I was really Minneapolis represent.
Do you want to all meet for lunch today? This is kind of neat.
Yeah. I was going to just simply comment that all the software and all the resources. If anyone in this chat is interested in sort of iterating on the Minneapolis process, it's all easily reproducible in your local municipality. And like the checklist is essentially make a website, get involved with some of the national groups. Like the EFF has the Electronic Frontier Alliance, which is a great sort of meta organization of like local surveillance activists, and then sort of just reaching out to your council member and finding a sympathetic council member to try and get some of these local surveillance ordinances pushed through and starting getting that movement going, because I feel like it just takes someone getting the ball rolling. And so like, it's important that we start iterating on, Minneapolis isn't the only place that's done this. There's a bunch of like local cities that have done this. So I think that it's important that people actually take this and go and do it in their own local jurisdiction.
Thanks very much, Chris. And I think what you, and Elizabeth, you also mentioned that there is a very important American perspective, but there's also a very global perspective, right? So I think
Yeah.
a lot of cities to be able to do that around the world, right? Because I think the issue is there with us.
Yeah, I mean,
Okay,
the EU is discussing this as well, and it's a very different conversation in the EU.
Absolutely. Let's just wait on that one. Let me just there's two people, I bring them in, and then so we can then have the last 10 minutes about trying to answer and the different comments. So I have Mateusz and then Celine. If you may, this is the last 10 minutes, be as short as possible. Okay, Mateusz.
Super concise. Hi, everyone. Thanks for the discussion. My question is, for the panelists, how do we incorporate regulations not only in the last phase of technological development and deployment and adaptations of these technologies within local councils and communities, but also in the beginning, in the ideation and trying to democratize the process of technological development as well. And also, if you can also talk a little bit, what's the role of imagination and art within this process? Thanks a lot.
Great. Celine, and then for the closure, Elizabeth and Bruce. Celine?
Hello.
Hi, Celine.
Can everyone hear me? So I want to say I thought this was incredibly insightful, especially what Elizabeth was saying about kind of inviting communities, ensuring their expertise is valued and not seeing it as an oppositional relationship between technology and communities. I think one thing I'm quite curious about is how in communities that are experiencing like historically racist or biased kind of policing or other city interventions, maybe how to build a feeling of trust so that people aren't suspicious of interacting with the city. They don't feel like they're selling out, so to speak, but that they actually have a meaningful voice in the process. They're open to collaborating. If that makes sense.
It does. Thank you very much. Elizabeth, we start with you. I think there was, because you, at the beginning, you really started about exactly what Mateusz was talking, right? Trying to influence the process, not just at the end, but trying to design somewhat the reflections and the process at the beginning. Please, Elizabeth.
Well, I can only talk about my particular experience in the how. It started with a desire, but that's because I have a certain lived experience that I wanted to, take into this process. And it started with curiosity. And before I even got involved with POSTME, I spent a year and a half as an appointee for the Racial Equity Community Advisory Committee here in Minneapolis, just listening and learning who the policymakers were and learning what their interests were and learning how the city of Minneapolis worked, so that by the time we formed with POSTME, I was able to make some initial introductions to some of the committees, Civil Rights Commission, the Racial Equity Community Advisory Committee, and a few other introductions to some powerful council members here. So I hope I'm answering the questions right, because we had a couple different questions, and I think Chris talked about ways to get involved in following the website that he put on there of how you can, transfer those same types of processes into your own city. But for me, I also think from a corporate perspective, because I've spent so much time in corporate America, that starting with learning events through various groups, there are lots of BRGs, ERGs, and opportunities I have found that you just start having the conversation and start storytelling. So I hope that helps.
Yeah, Mateusz, does that respond to your question?
Yes, I'm wondering if you could expand on the part of the the visual arts / imagination, considering that it's also, I think, a mission of the Edgelands Institute to tackle that question.
Well, I like that part because I'm a creative. And so I've written children's stories around AI. And I'm also creative, which is how I think about everything. I think about everything as a puzzle. And so in my presentations, a lot of times when I first started doing, I used avatars. I used that as a way to kind of take down some of the barriers, because as Celine mentioned, when we start talking about racism and racial justice, there are a lot of people that will shut down, especially here in Minneapolis. A lot of people are doing really good work, but they think maybe you are calling them a racist, and that's not it. And so I have found different ways to approach these conversations by tearing down some of the walls. And arts and visualization for me has been a part of that. But I think, Yves, this is part of what Edgelands does. So maybe we can talk.
And you just saw in the chat, no, thank you for that. And maybe, Mateus, what you could do is, we had a Café Croissant, the last month, where we really explored how art is not just central, but it's really also research, and how it helps, in fact, to have the conversation that you're then done stuck with experts, but you can then open it in a much more interesting way. And happy to explore that with you a bit more. Bruce, you take on the 2 questions, and then we will conclude.
All right, so very quickly, it's hard to regulate the beginning of these processes. We tend to regulate outcomes because that's what we can see, that's what we can judge, and that makes sense. And the way to affect the beginning of the processes is through a back channel. So if we regulate outcomes, if corporations know that if their output is overly surveillance or discriminatory or somehow harm society, and they'll be regulated to not do that, that will push back into the development process to ensure that the stuff doesn't happen in the first place. This is hard, but this is what works for product safety. This is what works for automobile safety. For anything we would want to affect the design process, and can only affect the outcomes. We have to strongly affect the outcomes. This is hard. It's hard work. We're fighting a lot of money, but that is the way to do it. And I like seeing public interest technologists on development staffs, just like you now have attorneys on development staffs, because they know they don't want to do anything that ends up being illegal. So it used to be you design your product, show it to legal, and they would say, make these changes. And then companies realize, put the attorneys on the teams in the beginning. That way they're designed properly. We need policy people on the teams in the beginning. And the way you do that is by regulating the end.
Great. Elizabeth, Bruce, thank you very much. That was absolutely wonderful. You did a fantastic work. Extremely interesting, a lot of food for thought. Beatrice, up to you to close it. We are exactly at 5 o'clock our time here and 9 o'clock Minneapolis.
10 o'clock.
No, this was
10.
wonderful.
Oh my God, yes, true, 10, sorry.
So
Go
we're
ahead.
right at the hour. So that's good on us. But we could have stayed here for a while. I think this was such a wonderful conversation. Thank you, Elizabeth and Bruce, for joining us. Eve, thank you also for wearing, and everyone for coming. There will be a blog post about this on our website soon, and a recording, so you can watch it again if you want, or recommend the conversation to someone else. And we will be hosting another Café Croissant next month, same timeline, sort of the last Friday of the month. So we'll keep you posted, and looking forward to seeing you again soon. Thank you, everyone. Bye.
Thank you. Bye.